Hello. Today we are going to read selections from one of my favorite books of all time, called The Journal of Vertebrate Paleontology, Volume 19, Number 1, March 15th, 1999. Today we're going to start off with an excellent story called A New Late Mesozoic Confuciusornithid Bird from China. Let's begin. During the last few years, rocks from the late Jurassic early Cretaceous transition in the northeastern Chinese province of Liaoning, Figure 1, have yielded a plethora of early bird specimens and their dinosaurian forebears. These specimens, often articulated, preserving portions of their integument and other soft tissues, have shed unprecedented light onto the origin of birds and their early evolution. Many of these recent discoveries, including Sinosauropteryx prima, Protarchaeopteryx robusta, Caudipteryx zoe, and Confuciusornis sanctus, came from the fine deposits of the Chiappe Formation, a lithic stratigraphic unit formerly regarded as the lower section of the Ji Qiang Formation. In the Sihetan-Jiashango area, Figure 1, the Chiappe Formation unconformably overlies the Middle Jurassic Tukenggzi Formation. The Chiappe Formation is subdivided into, from oldest to youngest, the Sihetan, Jiulongsong, and Hangdaozi members, while the Jiulongsong member has yielded most of the dinosaurs, including birds. From the Chiappe Formation, the lacustrine, grayish-yellow and grayish-green tufaceous sandstones, siltstones, and silty mudstones of the Hangdaozi member have yielded a large variety of plants, insects, fishes, turtles, and birds. Among the specimens of primitive birds from the Hangdaozi member housed at the National Geological Museum of China in Beijing, one specimen, represented by a slab and a counterslab, initially thought to be of Confuciusornis sanctus, displays morphological differences with the latter that distinguish it as a new taxon. This new bird, Changchengornis hangdaoziensis, is preliminarily described here, and issues concerning its anatomy and phylogenetic relationships are discussed. A detailed description of its morphology will be provided elsewhere. Systematic paleontology. Aves, Metornithes, Confuciusornithidae. Known taxa: Confuciusornis sanctus and Changchengornis hangdaoziensis. These two taxa are from the late Jurassic early Cretaceous Chiappe Formation of northeastern China. Diagnosis: Metornithine birds with toothless jaws, forked rostral end of mandibular symphysis, a single round foramen pneumatizing the dorsal maxillary wall of the antorbital fossa, large and subquadrangular deltopectoral crest of humerus, claw of manual digit 2, much smaller than those of digits 1 and 3, V-shaped caudal margin of sternum. Changchengornis hangdaoziensis, Janet Spivnov, Figures 2 and 3. Here is Figure 2. Here is Figure 3. Etymology: Changcheng, Chinese, Great Wall. Ornis, Greek, bird. Hangdaozi, referring to the stratigraphic horizon where it was collected. Holotype, National Geological Museum of China collection GMV2129-8-B. Part and counterpart of a nearly complete specimen, including most of the plumage. Figures 2 and 3. Here is figure 2, and here is figure 3. Horizon and locality. Jingshangu village, about 25 kilometers south of Beipiao City, western Liaoning province, northeastern China. Figure 1. Hengdaoji member, Chaomedianzi Formation, a newly established unit, formerly regarded as the lower part of the Yijingyang Formation, most likely late Jurassic, although possibly early Cretaceous. Diagnosis: Confuciusornithid with a strongly curved beak, mandible that is very high caudally and much shorter than the skull, deltopectoral crest of humerus not perforated by a large foramen as in Confuciusornis, metacarpal 1 nearly half the length of metacarpal 2, hallux proportionally longer than in Confuciusornis. Anatomical description: roughly the size of a blue jay, Chiappe bears a toothless, subtriangular skull in lateral view, with a sharp and strongly down-curved rostrum. This condition differs drastically from the straight rostrum of Confuciusornis. As in Confuciusornis, small nutrient foramina on the side of the rostrum suggest that it was covered by a corneous beak. The premaxilla fuse to each other only at their tips. Although the precise outline of the antorbital fenestra is unclear, it is evident that the antorbital fossa was medially walled by the nasal process of the maxilla. A round foramen perforating this dorsal maxillary process is either the maxillary or promaxillary fenestra of theropod dinosaurs, but its homology to either one of these two fenestra cannot be ascertained. The two mandibular rami. Interestingly, the mandible of Chiangornis is much shorter than the skull. In this respect, Chiangornis also differs from Confuciusornis, in which the mandible is as long as the skull. The two mandibular rami form a rostral synthesis, although the mandibular tip is deeply notched. Caudally, the mandible is remarkably tall, decreasing abruptly in height toward the articular surface, another feature distinguishing the new taxon from Confuciusornis. In the vertebral column, the dorsal centra are laterally excavated by an oval fossa, a condition known in a variety of Mesozoic birds. The synsacrum is formed of 7 elements and followed by at least 6 free caudals. The distal caudals are fused, forming a straight pygostyle that is as long or even longer than the tail portion of the free caudals. In the thoracic girdle, the coracoid is elongated but only half of the length of the scapula. The robust furcula is boomerang-shaped. Interclavicular angle is about 85 degrees, bearing a weak tubercle on the caudal surface of its apex. No such tubercle exists in Confuciusornis. Chiangornis has a huge, large sternum that is flat with no indication of a keel. Caudally, the sternum overlaps the first 2 rows of gastralia. 8 additional rows follow behind the tip of the sternum. The robust humerus is similar to that of Confuciusornis. The large deltopectoral crest, however, is not perforated by a foramen, as in Confuciusornis. The ulna and radius are somewhat shorter than the humerus. Table 1. The manual digital formula is 234XX. Metacarpal 1 is subrectangular and proportionally long, almost half the length of metacarpal 2. Table 1. In this respect, Qiang differs from Confuciusornis and most other birds, in which metacarpal 1 is no more than 1/3 the length of metacarpal 2. Metacarpal 2 is somewhat longer than metacarpal 3. These metacarpals remain unfused distally. The 3 manual digits bear claws. As in Confuciusornis, digit 2 ends in a small claw, much smaller than those of the other digits of the hand. Little is known about the pelvis of Qiang. The pubis forms a straight distal synthesis. The pubic apron is no more than 1/3, and probably much less than, the total length of the pubis. The femur is slightly bowed cranially and shorter than the straight tibiotarsus. The rod-like fibular spine is reduced and does not reach the proximal tarsals. Metatarsals 2 through 4 are fused proximally, and metatarsals 3 and 4 fuse to each other along the distal 1/4. Metatarsal 5 is rather long, extending nearly 1/3 the length of metatarsal 4. The foot of Qiang is anisodactyl. The hallux is approximately 2/3 the length of digit 2. Table 1. Not 1/2 the length of this digit, as in Confuciusornis. The plumage of Qiang is spectacularly preserved, forming a dark halo around its skeleton. Feathers are primarily preserved as carbonizations, but some have also left impressions. Barbs and shafts are visible on some of the flight feathers. In the tail there is no evidence of a retrocele fan, although some feathers clearly originated from the retrocele bulb around the pygostyle. Interestingly, the tail bears 2 feathers with a preserved length sub-equal to that of the body. Specimens with identical tail feathers have been reported for Confuciusornis. These ribbon-like feathers show neither barbs nor shafts. Discussion. Although the general morphology of Qiang is remarkably similar to that of Confuciusornis, there are some important differences between them. The most obvious differences are concentrated in the skull. The curved beak and the much shorter and taller mandible of Qiang are very different from the straight beak, the sub-equal lengths of the skull and mandible, and the sub-parallel dorsal and ventral margins of the mandible in Confuciusornis. These differences, along with the presence of a proportionally longer hallux, suggesting a more advanced perching foot, imply important feeding and ecological differences between these 2 taxa. Qiang is the sister taxon of Confuciusornis. Figure 4. Its phylogenetic relationships to other early birds are essentially the same as those of Confuciusornis. Hood et al. Proposed that Confuciusornis was the sister group of the late Cretaceous Enantiornithine Gobipteryx. Later, these authors placed Confuciusornis as the sister group of Enantiornithes. In both hypotheses, Hu et al. Embraced Martin's proposed sister group relationship between Archaeopteryx and the Enantiornithes, a group called Saurourae. The evidential support for Saurourae has been critically evaluated elsewhere and considered a paraphyletic group, and need not be repeated here. The monophyly of Saurourae has not been supported by any other cladistic analysis. Confuciusornithids share several derived characters with Enantiornithines and Ornithorines, including a fusion of the rostral portion of the premaxilla, a pygostyle, a supracondylar nerve foramen displaced toward the medial margin of the coracoid, an ulnar shaft that is considerably thicker than the radial shaft, a well-defined scar marking the insertion of the M. brachialis anticus on the proximal end of the ulna, a tibiofibular crest on the distal end of the femur, and a distally reduced fibula that does not articulate with the proximal tarsals convergent with mononychine alvarezzosaurids. At the same time, Confuciusornithids, like many of the synapomorphes that diagnose the ornithothoraces, including a cup-shaped maxillary sinus, fewer than 13 dorsal vertebrae, a coracoid and scapula that articulate through localized facets, a sharp scapular caudal end, a well-developed olecranon fossa, a distinct extensor process of metacarpal 1, an alular digit no longer than metacarpal 2, and an alula. This character distribution supports Chiappe's suggestion that Confuciusornithidae is the sister group of Ornithothoraces. Figure 4. A monophyletic taxon formed by Enantiornithes plus Ornithurae. Hu et al. Have interpreted the curved claws of the hands and feet of Confuciusornis as climbing adaptations, arguing that the structure of the pelvis of Confuciusornis supports their conclusion. They reconstructed this bird in an upright, scroll-like posture unknown for any other bird or non-avian dinosaur. In our view, even though the foot design of Ji Qiang suggests a superior grasping capacity to that of Confuciusornis, no climbing specializations can be found in either taxon. The pronounced curvature of the manual claws is a primitive feature. The proportions between the non-ungulophalanges of pedal digit 3 of Confuciusornis and Ji Qiang are different from those of modern specialized perchers or tree climbers. The correlation between a specific type of pelvis and arboreality still remains to be demonstrated. Hu et al. Argued that the long tail feathers of certain specimens of Confuciusornis were similar to those of Archaeopteryx and modern magpies, but the ribbon-like tail feathers of Confuciusornis and Ji Qiang are very different from both the frond-like tail of Archaeopteryx and the graduated tail of magpies, which have a median pair of feathers projecting beyond the previous pair. The presence of long ribbon-like tail feathers in some, but not all, well-preserved specimens of Confuciusornis. That's a big spider. Where did it come from? One moment. Okay. Confuciusornis hints at the presence of sexual dimorphism. The same can be argued for Ji Qiang, though in this case a single specimen is thus far known. This may be the first clear evidence of sexual dimorphism among Mesozoic birds. Sexual dimorphism, however, may not be the only explanation for the presence of long tail feathers in some Confuciusornis and Ji Qiang specimens. Immaturity or molting could also account for it. Thus, this phenomenon warrants further investigation. The end. Thank you for joining me. Good night.